1. And the Lord said. Moses passes on to another plague, whereby God took vengeance on the treachery and obstinacy of the wicked king, viz., that he gave over the remaining produce of the year, which he had spared, to be eaten and devoured by locusts. And this was no ordinary punishment, to destroy Egypt by dearth and famine, when all their corn had perished. But, before Moses proceeds to this, he again relates that he was the proclaimer of this plague, and that God had announced to him the reason why Pharaoh had so often resisted to his own injury. Therefore God says, that he had hardened his heart, in order that he might show forth these miracles and evidences of his power, for if Pharaoh had been humbled, and had yielded immediately, the contest would have been superfluous, since what would be the object of contending with a conquered and prostrate enemy? The obstinacy of the tyrant, then, in so often provoking God, opened the way to more miracles, as fire is produced by the collision of flint and iron. Thence also the silly imagination is refuted, that the heart of Pharaoh was no otherwise hardened than as the miracles were set before his eyes, for Moses does not say that his heart was divinely hardened by the sight of the signs, but that it pleased God in this manner to manifest his power. Hence also we gather, that whatever occurred was predestinated by the sure counsel of God. For God willed to redeem his people in a singular and unusual way. That this redemption might be more conspicuous and glorious, he set up Pharaoh against himself like a rock of stone, which by its hardness might afford a cause for new and more remarkable miracles. Pharaoh was, therefore, hardened by the marvelous providence of God with this object, that the grace of his deliverance might be neither despicable nor obscure. For God regarded its own people more than the Egyptians, as immediately appears, that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son, and of thy son's son, etc. For far more abundant material for thanksgiving and for celebrating the memory of their deliverance was afforded, by the fact of the Israelites having seen God's arm stretched forth so often from heaven, and with so many prodigies. Had they been redeemed by any ordinary method, the praise due to God would soon have been forgotten. It was proper, then, that their posterity should be thus instructed by their fathers, that they might have no doubts as to the author of so illustrious a work. But it is here required of the fathers, who had been eyewitnesses of the signs, that they should be diligent and assiduous in teaching their children, and on these also, care and attention in learning is enjoined, that the recollection of God's mercy should flourish throughout all ages. The practical effect of this doctrine is seen in Psalm 44 and Psalm 105:3. And Moses and Aaron came in. Moses now relates how, at God's command, he tried whether Pharaoh's heart, after so many experiments, would be bent to obedience out of fear of the new punishment which impended. But by this proof his impiety was better known, since, although he saw his kingdom deprived of a part of its corn, he fears not what is denounced by Moses respecting the other part. Therefore he reproves him still more severely, inquiring, How long wilt thou proudly resist the command of God? For since plagues vanquish even the worst natures, it was marvelous that the king, having been smitten 8 times, and in so awful a manner, was still unwilling to yield, as if he were in safety, and unaffected by any injury. But we may learn from this passage, that we are chastised with this object by the rods of God, that we may return from the indulgence of our lusts to submission to him. This Moses calls, and Peter after him, 1 Peter 5-6, to humble ourselves before God, or beneath his mighty hand, when, having experienced his formidable power, we reverently submit ourselves to his dominion. Whence it follows, that they, who are neither tamed nor bent by the fear of punishment, struggle against God as with an iron. 116, brow. Let fear, then, teach us to repent, and that we may not provoke his vengeance by proud contempt, let us learn that nothing is more terrible than to fall into his hands. Moses also hints that Pharaoh's contention was not with the Israelites only, but with God who undertook their cause. And let us not doubt, therefore, that all tyrants, who unjustly persecute the Church, contend with God himself, to whose powers they will find themselves far inferior. 4. else, if thou refuse." Moses denounces the extreme dearth and famine of the land of Egypt, because the locusts will suddenly arise, altogether to consume the remaining produce of the year, for half of it had already been destroyed by the hail. But, although ancient histories bear witness, and it has happened also in our time, that not only cornfields, but that pastures have been devoured by locusts, still we may gather from the circumstances, that this was an extraordinary instance of the divine vengeance, because Moses both appoints the next day, and also relates that an incredible multitude suddenly burst forth, and adds, that such had never been seen, and, lastly, threatens that no house should be exempt from their invasion. Moreover, it is worthwhile again to remark the nature of the scourge, that God collects and arms a host of vile insects, whereby he may insultingly overcome this indomitable tyrant with all his forces. The ingratitude of Egypt, too, was worthy of this return, since it was too great an indignity that the posterity of Joseph should be tyrannically persecuted in that country, which a little more than 250 years before he had preserved from famine by his energy. What follows in verse 6, that he turned himself, and went out from Pharaoh, is recorded as a token of his indignation, as though Moses, worn out with the perverseness of the tyrant, had hastily withdrawn himself from him, without bidding him farewell. Therefore, although he was otherwise of a mild disposition, this peremptory harshness was to be adopted as a reproof of the arrogance with which the tyrant spit in the face of heaven itself. But, let the pharaohs of our age also learn, that when they impede by their cruel menaces the pure worship of God, it is in his strict justice that fanatics, like locusts, assail their kingdoms with their impious errors, and infect their people with contagion. 7. And Pharaoh's servants said unto him, We have seen, a little above, that they were obstinate in common with their king, nor can it be doubted that by their servile flattery they had blinded him more and more, but now, conquered by their calamities, and fearing something still worse, they seek to mitigate his fury, not because they had themselves returned to their senses, but because they feel that they are overcome by the hand of God, and that strength to resist had failed them. They say, therefore, that Moses, until he should be dismissed, would be a constant source of evil to them. Whether you translate the word MVQS 117, Mokesh, a snare or a stumbling block, is of little consequence, because it is taken metaphorically for every kind of misfortune or injury. They signify, then, that no end of their troubles was to be expected so long as Pharaoh shall contend with Moses, for that evils would follow upon evils. By the question how long? They admonish him that his pertinacity had already been more injurious than enough, and thence they conclude that there is nothing better to be done than, by the expulsion of Moses, to free himself from the snare, or to avoid the stumbling block, since he could only fight unsuccessfully. As to the second part of the verse, interpreters differ. The Chaldee paraphrase translates it with the introduction of a negative, Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Word for word it is, whether to know before, or before that to know. But because the infinitive is sometimes taken for the future, thus does it seem to accord very well with the sense, Do you wish to know the destruction of the whole kingdom before you desist from your unhappy contention? As if they had said, that unless God should avert his anger, the remedy would be soon too late and useless.